Hello, everybody, and welcome today. My name is Marianne Stevenson. I am chairing this event on behalf of the Women's Budget Group, where I'm the director, and the Women's Environmental Network. And what we're doing today is launching the final report of 2 years' work and partnership between the Women's Budget Group and the Women's Environmental Network, looking at feminist Green New Deal. And I'd very much like to thank our funders, the Friends Provident Foundation, who've made that work possible, also Polden Puckham Foundation, who have contributed to specific parts of the work, and in particular to our partners, the Women's Environmental Network, for their work that they've done on the project to make sure that the voices of the most marginalised women are heard. To give you a bit of structure for today, we've got a brilliant lineup of panelists, and I'm going to introduce each one individually before they speak. We're going to have questions and answers at the end. So if you want to use the Q&A function to send questions, I'm suggesting that rather than the chat function, because sometimes questions can get a bit lost in the chat. Please feel free to join in the discussion on chat if you want to. If you're on Twitter, there are two hashtags. One is Green and Caring Economy, and the other is Feminist Green New Deal, as well as the hashtag for COP27, which is obviously happening at the moment. And all of those will be placed in the chat, but if you're on Twitter, if you could use those hashtags. What I'd like to do is to start with a short video that we have produced along with the Women's Environmental Network, showing our vision of what a green and caring economy would look like. And I think it's really important to start with this vision, because sometimes when we're thinking about the challenge of the climate emergency, it's very easy to get depressed and pessimistic. And I think one of the things that I really love about this video is it shows that another way of living is possible, another way of organising our economy and our society that's both environmentally and socially sustainable is possible, and it gives us a positive vision for the future. So Erin, can you please play the video?
Our planet and our economy are in crisis. Our current system has created climate change, ecological breakdown, and rising inequality. Women and other marginalised groups bear the brunt of these crises. But it doesn't have to be this way. By putting well-being before profit, we can build a green and caring economy that looks after everyone and the earth we live on. Let's imagine what life in a green and caring economy could look like. You wake up in a warm, affordable flat in one of the many new social housing buildings. You take a cheap, regular bus as part of an expanded public transport system, while others walk or cycle down roads no longer dominated by cars. You have a well-paid, flexible job helping people retrofit their homes to save energy. Your partner works a shorter working week, so you share paid and unpaid work equally. You have more time to buy and cook affordable, sustainably produced food, grown on one of the new publicly owned farms or your community allotment. You can depend on free childcare and a universal social care service with well-paid staff that tailor their care to individual needs. We can build a green and caring economy that looks after everyone and the planet we live on.
Thank you very much. I hope you find that video as powerful as we did, and it really sums up the vision that's set out in the report that we're launching today. And so I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Rebecca Diskey, who is the author of that report and has been working with the Women's Budget Group on the Feminist Green New Deal project. Rebecca is a researcher focusing on work and intersectional inequality in the context of climate and ecological breakdown. And she's currently doing a PhD at the University of Warwick. So, Rebecca, over to you.
Great, thank you, and hello everyone. Nice to see so many names in the chat. What I'm going to do is give a brief overview of the report, which will skim over a lot of the detail, but hopefully we'll get into some of that with some of the other panelists' speeches, talks, and then also in the Q&A. So I think Erin is going to put the slides up. Thank you very much. So yeah, just to begin with a tiny bit of background, this project was devised because most conversations about a low carbon future, even those which envisage a complete overhaul of our economy, have generally paid little attention to gender and intersectional inequality. And that's important, as many of you will know, because women and other marginalised groups already do and will continue to experience the most acute effects of climate and ecological breakdown. So it's urgent that we not only build a green, but also a caring economy, so that we're not just baking in or even exacerbating existing inequalities. Could you go to the next slide, please? So our starting point is that the climate and inequality crises share the same root, and that root is our careless economic system, which relies on the exploitation of the planet and the people who live on it. This week, as you know, is the beginning of COP27. That's 27 COPs, but also global meetings on climate change have been happening even longer than those 27 years. And you can see from this graph that in that time, greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise, as have temperatures and the frequency of climate-related disasters. So our Prime Minister in the UK decided relatedly to attend COP, claiming UK climate leadership and talking up the kind of opportunities for green growth, while the government this year made available over 100 new oil and gas licenses. And meanwhile, the most vulnerable in our society will be unable to heat their homes this winter, in part because of our dependence on a volatile fossil fuel market. So all that to say, it's clear that this system cannot deliver the change that we need. Next slide. But few politicians are able to articulate a vision of a future in which we're living within planetary boundaries and life is actually better. So that's what we're trying to do in this report. It's a vision of what a green and caring economy could look like, rather than a roadmap of exactly how to get there. And that hopefully will come next. It's based on several Women's Budget Group research papers from experts in a range of areas, including work, social security, housing, and it's also drawing from workshops with grassroots women's organisations run by WEN, which Rashini will talk about shortly. So the video you just saw sketched out how life could be better in a green and caring economy. First, to get there, we identify these 4 structural changes. So reorienting the economy around well-being rather than profit, and ending GDP growth as our main economic objective. Definitely phasing out fossil fuel industries and supporting other energy-intensive industries to decarbonise, retool, or even wind down. And of course, we do need to invest in low carbon infrastructure. But one of the main points of this project is making the argument for also investing really significantly in social infrastructure. So that's the healthcare, healthcare and education services that we all need to live, to survive and thrive. Jobs in these sectors are inherently low carbon. That's because they're based on personal interactions and relationships rather than producing stuff. Not to say they couldn't be greener, but they are certainly green compared to other jobs in the economy. And we need many more of them. Crucially, we also need to pay them and value them properly. The second structural change is around ownership models. So democratizing ownership of natural resources and key services, redefining access to the things we need, land, food, energy, water, and care as rights rather than commodities. Within that, we argue for renationalising energy, including through a new public renewable energy company, rolling back private provision in public services, particularly in care, ending public land sell-offs, and supporting alternative ownership models throughout the economy. The third is rewiring fiscal and monetary policy, so directing financial flows away from carbon-intensive projects and towards green and caring activities. And fourthly, supporting a global green and carrying economy. So acknowledging that although this project is focused on the UK, the crises we're facing are global and therefore require a global solution. Climate justice requires that the UK take a fair share approach to its own decarbonisation, meaning we need to go further and faster while also supporting poorer countries. And at the same time, the UK should use its position to advocate for debt relief, gender-sensitive climate finance, reforming international financial institutions, clamping down on tax havens, and ending exploitative treaties. The next slide, please. So that architecture would allow us to live our lives differently. And we identify 6 main areas where we would like to see change. The first is where and how we live. So in a green and carrying economy, housing has to be prioritised as a home rather than an asset. Everyone should have a right to somewhere safe and affordable to live, as the UN has recently advised. That means transforming the private rental sector, so away from buy-to-let properties, bringing down rents, guaranteeing security of tenure, and reoccupying long-term empty homes. At the same time, we need to build new social housing, devolving power to local authorities and communities to plan and build, and ensuring that new homes use more sustainable materials, are energy efficient and resilient to future climate change. At the same time, housing is also a key source of greenhouse gas emissions. So we desperately need to retrofit existing housing stock to reduce those emissions and drive down energy costs, crucially for those in fuel poverty, particularly relevant this year, obviously. The next slide looks at how we travel. So transport produces 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and road transport is by far the largest contributor to that. So we often hear about the need to replace current vehicles with electric ones. And while EVs do not produce emissions themselves, they still largely run on electricity generated by fossil fuels. And they also have a carbon intensive production process and require mining raw materials largely from the global south at great human and environmental cost. So our argument is that we can't just replace like for like. Another problem with a car-centric approach is that it could just reproduce existing inequalities. Women, racialized groups, disabled people, and people on low incomes are much less likely to own a car, but that doesn't insure them against the effects of congestion, of air pollution, and of the lack of public space associated with car-centered design. So instead, a green and carrying economy would see investment in well-connected, integrated and widespread public transport networks, with an emphasis on improving bus services and active travel routes. The next aspect of life is rethinking how we work and how much we work. So prioritising socially valuable work, redistributing paid and unpaid work, and freeing up time for other pursuits. And one way of doing that is through a shorter working week. So not on its own, though, we argue that against a background of improved and expanded care provision, reformed parental leave, greater job security, higher minimum wages, a shorter working week would allow more women into the workforce and more men to spend more time on domestic work and care. Evidence shows that working longer hours is also correlated with more environmentally harmful consumption patterns. So working less could free up time for lower impact behaviours, such as spending time with family and friends, exercising, shopping locally, and volunteering. The next slide is on how we shop, which still remains, consumption still remains a taboo in a lot of mainstream conversations on climate and ecological breakdown. But we make the point that as many others have, that the current levels are unsustainable. In fact, research shows that as consumption rises, and it is continuing to rise, particularly among the richest, its environmental impact cancels out the environmental gains achieved by technological progress in things like renewable energy. So to say, it's obviously we're not all over-consuming, and in the UK, the poorest half of the population consume the same amount of energy as the richest 5%. So there is absolutely enough to go around, but we must use and distribute it with more care. In a green and carrying economy, everyone would have access to the goods they need, and those would be durable and designed to be reused and repaired. Another thing that we do when we shop and when we consume is eat food. So the next slide is on food and talks a little bit about the inequality that characterises our current food system, where in the UK over 2 million people rely on food banks, but we waste 9.5 million tonnes of food every year. And another kind of injustice in the food system is jobs. Food jobs are notoriously low paid and precarious and are disproportionately occupied by women and migrants. So a green and caring economy would reform the way we eat to value the nature and the people who produce food, while dramatically reducing its environmental impact and improving public health. And we talk here, just on the slides, there are a couple of the key ways of doing that, crucially shifting to plant-based diets, which would require up to 80% less farmland in the UK, and supporting more nature-friendly methods. And finally, reimagining how we care for people is central to a green and caring economy. As we all know, care is in crisis. In England, almost 2 million people have unmet care needs, while women and ethnic minority workers bear the brunt of low pay and insecure contracts. So we've called at the Women's Budget Group for a universal quality social care service, which would promote care receivers' well-being and autonomy while improving paying conditions for staff. And we also argue for a universal childcare service up to primary school age. Creating those new care jobs and crucially paying them properly would reduce inequality, it would reduce the burden on unpaid carers, and it would help redistribute unpaid care more equitably within the room. And crucially, again, care provision must be disentangled from profit seeking, which has compromised care quality. So that's a very quick overview, a whiz through of the report, and there's lots more detail and ideas in the report itself and in the papers on the website, which I'm sure someone will post a link to in the chat, and hopefully we can get into more of that in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and I really urge everyone to read the report, which is really, sets out in detail the sort of a vision for a different way of living, organising our economy, and living in a way that's environmentally and socially sustainable. A key part of the project that we did with the Women's Environmental Network was a series of roundtables or workshops organised by WEN with women from grassroots community organisation to talk to them about the issues that concern them around climate change and the environment. And so I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Roshini Thamatharam from the Women's Environmental Network, who's a feminist researcher, educator, facilitator and organiser, and organised these workshops. Roshini holds a Master's in Race and Social Justice and is WEN's Campaign and Project Coordinator. So Roshini, can you tell us about the themes and insights from the workshops with the grassroots organisations, please?
Sure, thanks, Marianne. Hi everybody, I'm Roshini Thamatharam and I work at the Women's Environmental Network. And like Marianne said, I've been facilitating the grassroots workshops we just heard about. So through existing and new connections, we held over 20 Feminist Green New Deal workshops with a wide range of women's and community organisations across the UK. The workshop discussion focused around what is needed to make a greener, fairer life and where would investment make a difference. These workshops aim to facilitate diverse groups of women to have an active voice in climate discussions. As the project began during the pandemic, we held both online and in-person workshops, which helped us reach more groups. Reoccurring themes came up in the workshops, however, each location did differ slightly in what would be the best use for investment. Improved transport ranked highly in all the workshops. For example, one participant from the Highfield Centre in Leicester stated that, "I want to be able to use a bike to get around, but I haven't got one and it doesn't feel safe. It's seen as weird to cycle around." This was a young woman who wants to cycle but still faces many barriers. Fatima Lee, the group convener, who on the back of the Feminist Green New Deal workshop came and spoke in Parliament last week to the Green New Deal APPG, where she addressed MPs and think tanks. This is the invaluable crossover of sectors that this collaboration has made possible. To quote part of Fatima's speech, "A lot fewer women cycle and fewer women of colour. This needs addressing with investment into making cycling accessible, targeted supported cycling schemes, as there are more gendered and racial structural barriers to cycling for many of the centre's users. supported purchasing of bikes and the infrastructure to make it safe, well lit, putting in place the support needed to make cycling accessible. Included in transport is the need for buses to be free of charge. This way, many of the people in our community, especially women, would be able to use it. For example, a mother of 3 that lives close to the centre has children in 2 different schools, and there is no bus that links these, and access to a car is not an option, end quote. To make a greener and fairer life, it was clear that acting on the ills of white supremacy was key. Quote, "We need time to heal from racism. It affects our bodies. We see it in older generations. We need to be able to eat well and just live. I'm very concerned about the microaggressions that we face every day. I've been looking into the various aspects of that impact, and I found out that it affects our major organs. I'm speaking of the melanated here, not Europeans. We on a day-to-day basis face racism, and what it does is depreciate your life on all corners, on all areas. You have the constant flight or flight state of being, which is not healthy. The West needs to repair the damage done to Africa and the Caribbean. Africa and the Caribbean have not caused damage, but are expected to act on climate change. The sea rising, the dryness, the droughts have been done by the first world, and yet it's the third world, or what they call the third world, inverted comma third world, because Africa is the basket of the world really in terms of resources. Some people need to give up something so it can be a more equal environment, and I can't see the people around us giving up stuff. Before we start thinking of insulating houses, we need to get the current houses up to a livable standard. There are real shambles of housings that people are currently living in that have dire living conditions. These were common themes in all of the workshops, alongside the need for accessible and safe green spaces and affordable and healthy food. These examples highlight how many climate policies and solutions can further embed structural inequalities, and without diverse perspectives and voices included and around the table, the systemic and structural changes needed won't happen. A workshop taking place began by reaching out to the group conveners from different women's and community groups to discuss the particular needs of their group, and so that we could tailor the workshop accordingly. These groups were already established, so I fitted into these existing spaces, which enabled us to have a wider reach. Each group had ways that would work better for them. From the language we used to using terms like feminist Green New Deal or climate sisters was one thing we often discussed in terms of exclusive language. Also the timings of the workshops, fitting them around caring responsibilities, for example. Some took place in the evening, some had to finish before school pickup. There is an importance of including access needs and ending the session on a hopeful note with a focus on next steps. These sorts of finer details often can get overlooked, but are crucial for increasing the participation of women and other marginalised groups in these debates. There was no one-size-fits-all approach. Amongst the groups we worked with were a Roma rights organisation with their women's group, a disability forum, Black and Green ambassadors, a Bengali women's group, an LGBTQ+ group, Support for Women Action Network group, inner city economically disadvantaged groups, rural groups, and many more across Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England. One overriding theme that went across all the groups we worked with was that having a space with peers to discuss all things climate and the everyday politics of it was very much appreciated, and there was a strong desire to continue with more workshops. A space where the everyday politics of how climate, gender, and other structural inequalities intersect was a much sought after space, with comments such as, "We don't need decisions made for us by people who don't look like us. What we really need is to be consulted." This is one of the best chats I've had in ages. The value of talking about big ideas is huge. Love the interactive conversations, would like to have had a longer discussion as some parts felt rushed at times. The workshop feels like the beginning of exciting new areas of work and campaigning of women's involvement in improving our environment. I have found it inspiring and a good space to explore wider issues that impact women, and in turn the environmental impacts, i.e. domestic labour, finances, etc. It was a good discussion, and I hope that the project will actually bring our voices and concerns to the relevant decision makers. I enjoyed it. Could do with another workshop. It was very inspirational. Each workshop was 2 hours, and a common theme was that more time was needed. These comments, I think, speak wonders. Women want to be included in the discussions and at the table. A group of young women we worked with wanted to have a workshop every month where they could continue the discussion. In other workshops, participants chose to keep a working group style set up for themselves. the workshop acting as a seed for further conversations and networks to develop. Thinking of the potential if the women who contributed to this report and key messaging document were included in all future climate and economic policy, how much everyone would benefit. This would be a win-win situation. We know this triple crisis of climate, inequality, and the cost of living cannot be solved unless we work in this way. The most affected communities must be on the decision tables, on the agenda setting tables. Through this project and participatory approach, we've facilitated 2 groups of women, the Climate Sisters Glasgow group and the Climate Sisters Support and Action Women's Network group, attending COP26, including co-designing and organising their own fringe event. This in itself is huge, to have women who have not been part of the conversations for overlapping systemic reasons not only attend COP26, but host an entire fringe event and take part in another fringe event, platforming, amplifying and censoring the voices we really need to hear, women's voices, racialised voices, lived experience voices. The idea that any groups are hard to reach is a fallacy. It's much more that the spaces are exclusive and discriminate over a multitude of macro, micro, covert and overt systems of oppression. I guess a huge takeaway here is that grassroots conversations and lived experience are vital to any solution to the triple crisis that can actually work. We're hoping we'll be able to take the findings, this report and the key messaging document back to the groups we held workshops with, a full circle rather than a take and no give scenario, and to really show how the information they shared has informed this report and share what's happening with the report as a sort of validation of the participation they've had in it. To feel heard, we know, is a crucial part of our well-being, especially after being unheard and excluded. We also plan to share this with other women's and community groups across the UK to increase involvement and engagement in this dialogue. We hope to be able to scale up and secure funding for the Climate Sisters project, part of our Feminist Green New Deal project, which is a 12-week feminist climate leadership program aiming to amplify women's and marginalised voices in the climate arena, which we were lucky enough to pilot through this project. Thank you for listening. Please do get in touch if you're interested in a Feminist Green New Deal workshop or in our Climate Sisters project.
Thank you very much, Roshini. That was great. I think the point you make about there's no such thing as people who are hard to reach, just people who are systematically excluded from the conversation, is a massively important one. And you can see from the kind of the range and depth of the conversations that you were able to have, how much would be added if those voices were around the table. But I think it's also really great to see that those groups of women that came together for those workshops have actually wanted to continue those conversations and continue the work together. I mean, that's something that's really positive to come out of this. So our next speaker is Sam Alvis, and we're really delighted he's able to join us here today. He is head of economy at the Green Alliance, and also a policy and political consultant specialising in net zero and the economy. He's also a member of Chatham House's Governing Council, focusing on widening access and research. Sam's worked as an advisor to the Labour Party and was a senior advisor to Tony Blair. And he's really going to present on how the economy can benefit from policies that tackle the climate crisis, you know, challenging this myth that sometimes occurs that dealing with the climate emergency is only something that we can afford to do in certain circumstances and can't afford to do in others. So Sam, over to you.
Thanks very much, Marianne, and thanks to Bereka and Roshini. It's a really wonderful vision to set out. I think that the thing that I'm most interested in, our focus, is what we can start thinking about doing now to make our way towards that vision. And as Dr. Stevenson said, for a long time, and particularly sort of thinking about the 2010s and the beginnings of this Conservative government, environmental action has been pitted against the economy in something that we can only afford to do, as George Osborne would say, when the sun is shining. And I think what I worry about is that with the election of Rishi Sunak and this return to the politics of debt and fiscal sustainability, that we are going to go down that tunnel again and see further cuts to the things that we know need to happen. So, but I do think actually now we're in a very different place. Partly with public opinion, we've seen the real impacts of climate change are whether through flooding, whether through extreme heat, and actually making it much more tangible that people want and are dying to see that action now. But alongside the other stuff you see, whether it's our failing infrastructure, our low quality public services, we are in the need for policies that are a triple win. And the vision that you set out is really a perfect way of encapsulating that. So I think in the next couple of years, at least, or in the run-up to the next election, alongside that vision, we need to be talking about the type of economy we want to see and how we're going to generate that. And I do think that comes down to, in the meantime, continuing to talk about economic growth, but redefining growth on a set of objectives that we think are more important than purely that GDP outcome. And for me, that comes down to lots of things, but actually even the most basic net zero and climate restorative actions are now growth generating. So if we think about active travel, which is really important to how women in particular get around urban spaces, active travel is often faster, it is lower cost, and it has greater economic spillovers than sitting stuck in a car using expensive petrol. So you have lower air pollution, you have greater physical and mental health. All these things are actually contributing to better growth than the form of transport we currently have. The same can be said for increasing green spaces, better mental health, better physical health. If people are happier, they work better, we have high productivity. If we have high productivity, that allows us the space to reduce working hours so people can do more of the things that they love in their spare time. And I think the big conversation at the moment is obviously around energy, and it's massively expanding renewables. And that is the most obvious economically beneficial policy that you can pursue at the moment. Replacing expensive foreign produced fossil fuels with cheaper domestic energy, not only does it mean we're spending less money overseas on importing that energy, but because that energy is currently imported, we create new high-skilled jobs in this country. There's a really positive story to tell there. And that's before you even start talking about reducing energy demand. I mean, I'm sat here with my hot water bottle under my shirt whilst I talk. It is really obvious, these things to people, both in their lived experience, but we have to remember as well that that does have wider economic benefits. I think some of the trickier stuff is what happens to the next bit of the transition, the stuff that is slightly less obvious to the public. But I still think there are really positive stories to tell, both to people and for the economy. So thinking about the just transition, we talk a lot about people and the jobs, but actually there's also going to be a lot of infrastructure, big buildings and pipelines and everything like that. And there's some great examples in Germany of how you can repurpose those old fossil fuel assets and turn them into new cultural centres, museums, art spaces, extending the life of existing infrastructure into new purposes, and new purposes that people are going to enjoy and benefit from more in local communities, again, is better for the economy and better for people. These things are just not any longer mutually exclusive. So I'll leave it there, but look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was really, really useful. And I think, you know, the points you make about how tackling the climate emergency can actually benefit the economy and help build a strong and healthy economy are really important ones, particularly at the moment when we're facing a cost of living emergency and a government that seems determined to frame everything in terms of the need to address what they're describing as a fiscal black hole. So I'd now like to move on to our final speaker, Mariam Bett, who is a researcher, is a researcher and political economist. She's a research fellow at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the Democracy Collective, and a board member at Green New Deal Rising and Commonwealth. And she is going to present on changing ownership models. Before I hand over to Miriam, I'd just like to say, please do put your questions in the chat, because we'll be taking questions at the end of her presentation. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, and thank you also for this report, which is a really important and timely intervention, and really shines a spotlight on the intertwined crises that we face just now. As mentioned, I'll be discussing all things ownership related, and so firstly, I mean, intrinsically linked to inequality, the causes and distributional consequences of climate breakdown are unevenly felt both within and between countries and global regions, with those that have contributed the least to it often at the sharp end of the crises. And in that sense, climate and environmental breakdown are really entrenching and further deepening already unacceptably high levels of inequalities in power and reward that are baked into the current ownership and operation of the economy, and this works to further undermine economic security of women and minoritized groups. And we're seeing that at hand just now with the kind of multiplied crises we face. It feels like wave after wave of crises just now, and women are of course being disproportionately hit by inflationary pressures. 42% of women on low wages have fallen behind on household bills compared to just 35% of men on low wages, and 35% of low paid women have skipped meals regularly for financial reasons. And these developments sit on the backdrop of long-term stagnant real wage growth, of drastic social security cuts over the course of a decade, of reductions in public service provision, all of which have hammered women's economic security. And what is needed is a whole-scale transformation of the economy to root it instead in one that is caring, that is fair, that is sustainable by design. And there are many, many areas to cover within this, and I'm going to touch upon just three. So the first is that of democratising energy. The current approach to the ownership and operations of energy companies points to much deeper, more systemic failures of a privatised energy market, and its implications both on energy security and supply. And this crisis has also exposed the sheer volatility and cost of our continued reliance on fossil capital. BP and Shell posted record quarterly profits, and over the past 5 years, the big six energy firms have paid out the equivalent of 82% of their pre-tax profits in dividends, while their effective tax rate has been only 13% over the same period. And just now we have a perfect storm, soaring profits for private firms and shareholders, footloose fossil capital benefiting from those eye-watering profits, while workers face real wage losses and levels of fuel poverty continue to rise dramatically. So where do we go from here? Well, it's increasingly clear that the current approach to energy ownership is failing. It's failing for consumers, it's failing for workers, it's failing for energy companies, and it's failing for an energy security strategy. And taking energy back into public ownership can be key both to securing the just transition for and kind of stewarding a just transition through a green industrial strategy, accomplishing better value for consumers, more and better paid jobs for workers, and accelerated rollout of renewable energy infrastructure that the UK so desperately needs right now. And importantly, public ownership of energy is already a reality in many other European countries. So in Germany, for example, 2/3 of all electricity is purchased from municipally owned energy companies. And since 2016, the Munich City Council has supplied enough renewable energy for the needs of every household. So crucially, while the fossil fuel age has been characterised by extractive, concentrated ownership, this transition to a green economy creates a chance to generate equitable, democratic energy infrastructures that are fit for the future, and in doing so, creating good unionised jobs throughout the country. The second topic I want to talk about is that of care and ownership of care, and the need to transition the economy to one rooted in care for society and for the planet as one has never been more urgent. And care work, both paid and unpaid, is vital for not only for delivering basic human needs required for our survival, but also care work should be understood as green work. It's inherently low carbon by nature. And there was an important report by STUC into adult social care in Scotland that found that staffing resources are 20% worse in the private care sector compared to the not-for-profit sector. And we need to reevaluate the current approach to care and place care in not-for-profit, ensuring that it's publicly owned and that it's tailored to the needs of local communities. And that it also is strengthened rather by sectoral collective bargaining to drive up pay and conditions for care workers, ensuring a decentralised approach to care delivery and ensuring that all local needs are met. So care should be, importantly as part of this, is the need to understand, and the report covers this really clearly as well in terms of understanding what an industrial strategy should mean, and broadening that out. It's often based on the foundation economy and areas of the economy that produce trade, for example. But care should be embedded at the heart of a green industrial strategy to scale those well-paid, secure green jobs and rapidly steward the economy towards one that is embedded in sustainability. And the third area I want to, and final area I want to address is that of commoning land, which again features heavily in the brilliant report. Land is a key expression of economic power, and concentrated ownership of land continues to be a central driver of inequality, and more equitable forms of ownership, use and management of land can be a key source to generating local wealth centred on climate and environmental stewardship, and to achieving social justice. And as the report points out, this is particularly important for women and other marginalised groups who are often excluded from decision-making spaces. And I want to highlight just one example before I wrap up here of what a more common approach to land can do, and the way that it can be intertwined with tackling the energy crisis and fuel poverty crisis as well. Over the last few years, I've been lucky enough to sit on North Ayrshire's Community Wealth Building expert panel, and they've created ambitious proposals to generate green, publicly owned, council-owned renewable energy. And if successful, this development will generate 277% of the council's future energy demands, and it's using derelict space as well, derelict land, and putting solar and wind farms on that, and generating 277% of the council's future energy demands. So not only would that be enough to provide for the council's future energy demands, but it could also potentially, the excess could be sold back, and the profits from that could be reinvested in tackling fuel poverty at a local level. Now that to me is a common sense approach to energy infrastructure, and tackles the climate crisis, it tackles the inequality crisis, and it tackles the energy crisis all at once. And there's a series of other measures that we could bring in to look at commoning land as well, from expansion of the right to buy, a public interest test that centres on sustainability for major land holdings, a mandatory system of certification for carbon credits to ensure that they are legit, and the introduction of land value tax as well. But conscious of time, so I'll wrap up here, but want to finish by saying that reorienting the economy to one that's rooted in extraction and inequality to one centred on care and connection and sustainability will require a fundamental rewiring and overhaul of our current economic system, but there has never been a more urgent time to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And if the other speakers want to come back on camera now so that we can see you all when we're doing the questions, that would be great. Thank you all to all of our speakers for a really, really brilliant set of presentations. And I hope that those of you who've been attending have been able to see from that kind of range of presentations the way in which it is possible to tackle a number of crises that we're facing at the same time at the moment, the climate emergency, but also the crisis of inequality and the current crisis in the cost of living. Now we've got a number of questions in the Q&A that I'm going to go to in a minute, and there's been a couple of others that have come up in the chat. So just to say, some people have been asking where the recording is going to be available if they've joined the meeting slightly late. It will be, a link to it will be on our website, and I hope very much on the WEN website as well, so that you can find it there. Link to the report will also be on the website. And I think there's been a number of practical questions about how to get in touch with people and things, and there's been various links put in the chat to that. So I'm just going to pick up on some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A box so far. If you haven't posted your question yet, now's a chance to do so. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of questions at the same time and then ask the panelists to focus in on the ones that they most want to answer. So the first question from Estelle Dohan, which says, well done all. The work needed to bring about change on these intersecting issues is daunting, but we're up to it. Is there one legislative or policy change you think that needs to be prioritised to unlock action? And that links to a question that was also raised by Martin Allen, who said, agree with everything that's been said. What is practical impact step one? So I know everyone's going to say this is a complicated problem and can't be solved with a single action, but maybe if we could start talking about what the first steps are, because as Miriam said, if you're talking about a complete transformation of the way we organise the economy and society, that's a long way from here to there. And often as movements, we can be quite good at describing the problem and good at coming up with a vision of the future. It's the steps along the way where things can break down. So it would be really good to hear from you on that. And maybe I'll go to the panel on that first before I come to some of the other questions. So kind of steps along the way, initial actions, what do you think's the first thing? And I will take that in the order that we had the speakers. So start with Rebecca.
Okay, I'll try not to caveat it with that's incredibly complex. I think if it's just to kind of hone in on this, like the specific way the question was phrased in terms of like legislative change, I think, you know, a very, very first step would be to get rid of the policy to maximise economic recovery from the North Sea. So at the moment, you know, it's law that the government has to get every last drop of oil and cubic inch of gas that can be economically retrieved and dig it up and sell it. And I think that absolutely has to be the starting point. We need to get rid of that and instead you know, properly phase out fossil fuels and look at what happens to those workers, and as Sam said, you know, the infrastructure that is left behind to make sure that there's a just transition for the people involved and the communities that rely on these industries, but also that we're making the most of the infrastructure itself and the skills that people have in those industries as well, which in many cases are very transferable. And then the slightly fudgy answer is that, you know, there is, for example, a Green New Deal bill that has been proposed by a group of cross-party MPs, which starts to reframe starts to approach the various different bits of law and policy that would need to change for us to reorient the economy around kind of greener and healthier and more caring activities. So lots of ideas in there, but it is a bit of an umbrella bill at the moment, as you'd expect. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much. Roshini.
Hi, sorry. I think it would need to be taxing the big energy companies, because that would provide the money to invest in the solutions that I think need to happen, you know, that have been discussed, the care work. Yeah, it seems like it's on maybe without the details, like a no-brainer, like the money's there, the solutions there, and we just need to be able to access that money to make the solutions happen.
Thank you. Sam.
Yeah, I mean, very similar to Roshini, I think regardless of what part of the political spectrum you're on, the journey towards a better climate requires a massive step change in public investment. How we spend that money might have different views, but raising it through those who are currently benefiting from climate breakdown is an absolute no-brainer. And in terms of legislative change, actually taking away their right to specific tax reliefs and that are written into deeds, incredibly complicated and very sneaky work that goes underseen. I think taking those away so that you are able to tax them more, so you don't have to give them more tax reliefs, frees up some of that fiscal space to do the investment we know we need.
Thank you. And Miriam.
Hiya. Yeah. Sorry, I've got a slightly croaky throat today, so I know a bit like Marge Simpson. Yeah, so to pick one, well, the UK is one of the most profitable countries in the world for oil and gas firms to operate in. And some work that we did at Commonwealth with the New Economics Foundation found that since the Paris Agreement, there's been £12 billion annually on average given in tax support for production and consumption of fossil fuels. And that's really not dramatically decreased since the Paris Agreement either. And so I think an overhaul of the tax system to instead redirect subsidies to sustainable energy generation and ensuring that that's done so in a way that's fair, that's democratic, that's rooted in shared prosperity, as well as a green economy that kind of stewards investment towards that, and that ensures that you have kind of public community stakes in these areas as well, is really central. As with the point that Rebecca made, I mean, I'm from an oil and gas community, and ensuring that any type of just transition is, making sure, to be blunt, that oil and gas workers and communities are not treated the way that Thatcher treated the coal miners in those communities, because it's a daunting prospect. So ensuring that there is good investment for oil and gas communities, ensuring that there is job guarantees, skills, upskilling of workers, proper levels of investment in these communities to ensure that it doesn't actually, that it carries those communities with them, that they have a prosperous future as well. But just now our tax system is so heavily geared towards benefiting primarily the shareholders of oil and gas companies and continued extraction in North Sea, that's contributing in a devastating way to climate and environmental breakdown, and that needs a complete overhaul.
Thank you. I'm going to take the next couple of questions in a group, and just for people who've been putting questions in the chat, do you mind re-putting them in the Q&A box? It's just that it's very difficult to keep an eye on questions in the chat because there's other conversations going on. So there's a question from Helen Lynn. What do you think of Rishi Sunak's failure to pledge any additional funding for loss and damage or reparations to poorer countries that have contributed least to climate change? And a question from Jane Gilbert: what impact will the proposals potentially have on pension funds? They are major state shareholders and rely on year growth so that we can all afford to live after we retire. And I think that I'll link that to a question from Georgia Taylor, which is coming from another perspective, which is, don't you think we need to be honest about the need to reduce consumption overall? This will not be growth but degrowth. Of course, some sectors will grow and we want them to, and employment also must go, and inequality must reduce, but some sectors have to reduce completely. So that's three questions. One on Rishi Sunak's failure to pledge additional funding for loss and damage and reparations to poorer countries, and then one on pension funds depending on growth, and then needing to be honest about the need to reduce consumption overall. So again, I'll start with Rebecca.
So yeah, to start with, I generally don't think much of Rishi Sunak's climate policy, and I think that he's not alone in his failure to recognise the UK and richer countries' responsibility to support poorer nations who are really, obviously much more on the front line and also much less responsible for the impacts of climate change. So I think that, at the very least, the 100 billion that was promised by richer countries 12 years ago now to poorer countries for loss and damage, must materialise, and the UK has a role in that, and I personally think that we should be playing a much bigger role than we are, and that's not just in terms of finance, it's also in terms of technology transfer, rather than trying to sell technology to poorer countries, actually acknowledging that if they are going to leapfrog the period of fossil fuel development that richer countries have gone through, they need technology transfer much quicker than we're seeing. And the second question was on pensions and growth. Yeah, so I mean, you'll see if you look at the report that this is very much kind of a vision, and it hasn't kind of been worked out. What we do say is that there will need to be obviously like an impact assessment at every level, because this is wholesale policy change throughout the economy. And I mean, in terms of pensions being affected by, for example, like fossil fuel investments, the proportion of pensions that actually are invested in fossil fuel is much smaller than we're often led to believe by people who bring that up as a point. And also the pension wealth actually is disproportionate, is very unequal in this country. So I think 50% of the pension wealth in this country is actually held by 10% of the population. So what I would say is that we would definitely need to assess the impact of all of these policies, but that the macro impact of them would be to protect people at every stage in their lives, including crucially through really good services, free services, universal services that people can access and that will protect them through their life course. And finally, just on lowering consumption, I think that yes, I think that's what we are arguing for, is an understanding that we need to reduce and improve and redistribute consumption. That will look different depending on where you are and on your income. Not everyone is over consuming, and I think should be frank that the people who need to consume less quickest are the people at the very top. There was a report by Oxfam earlier this week that said the 128 billionaires consume, can't remember what it is, the same as a billion people or something. So there's absolutely we need to acknowledge consumption levels, but we definitely need to do it in a way that is not kind of completely across the board.
Thank you. Sam.
Thanks. Just a couple of points. I think on pensions, I'll leave that mostly to Miriam and Commonwealth's amazing work on ownership structures. But just to say that, particularly when it comes to the fossil fuel industry, is actually UK pensions own a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of shares in the UK-based fossil fuel industries. So the effects are pretty small. On consumption, yeah, I agree. We absolutely have to change consumption patterns, and part of that will come through increased efficiency, particularly resource efficiency. If we're embracing the circular economy, if we're reusing, recycling, remanufacturing more, actually lower inputs, change the pattern of consumption to a more sustainable way, and also consuming more services over goods. So we need to, I think, changing consumption, as Rebecca says, is definitely the right framing, rather than, I don't think it's necessarily the best pitch to voters and the public that everything is about lowering degrowth and reducing consumption. Although that is, in some places like flying, that is just what will happen. And then the second part of the question on we need more employment. Actually, I'd say, so in terms of the UK economy, we have really relied on low productivity employment for a long time, notably since the financial crash. We have people who work very, very hard with very, very poor resources to produce not a great deal. And that makes it very hard to meet some of the things in this vision, like having more time to spend with family and friends and arts and culture and all the other things that make life important. So we actually need to look at how we can increase capital expenditure as well, so that people are able to get more out of their time when they're working, increasing the use of technology, things like heat pumps, things like more efficient modes of travel, to allow people that time back so they can use it in more personally productive ways.
Thank you. Sorry, Roshini, I didn't mean to miss you. I was planning to do things in order. I'll go to you next.
No worries, that's okay. I honestly don't know really how to talk about Rishi Sunak, other than it's just a huge disaster for any of the solutions. Climate reparations came up in the workshops. A lot of workshop participants have global links and cultural heritage in countries most affected by climate change. So it's really quite hard hitting. On some of the other questions, cutting down, I think, and degrowth could be in our polluting sectors, but then to see the growth in the caring sectors And also, when thinking about cutting down, thinking about the sorts of things that when campaigns on, having alternatives to fossil fuel products like reusable period products and nappies and local food growing and things such as this, which we could do now, which we could start now. We wouldn't need to wait. And what else? Maybe I don't know much to speak on pension funds, but just other than like each individually being aware of where you work and how they invest their pensions, looking for sort of ethical pension fund schemes. And I think I'll have to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roshini. And Miriam.
Yeah, some great questions. So firstly, on loss and damages, I mean, there's just a massive enhanced onus on wealthy countries like the UK, who have contributed disproportionately, both historically and today, to climate and environmental breakdown, to ensure there are adequate loss and damages provided. I'm going to post a couple of links in the chat there, because we commissioned a couple of fantastic academics to do some reports on loss and damages there, so I'll post them in the chat. On the question of pensions, so Commonwealth, alongside the High Pay Centre, did some research for the Trades Union Congress, which basically found that only a tiny proportion of UK dividends and buybacks actually accrue to UK pension funds, and the returns, as Rebecca mentioned as well about the inequalities here, the returns that do accrue to pension savers are highly unequally allocated and disproportionately benefit a wealthy minority. So all of that should be taken into consideration when we're discussing this too. On the question on consumption, I mean, yeah, there's huge disparities in consumption patterns and in emissions associated with that as well. Wealthy people emit a much higher rate than poorer people overall. Despite that overall trend, poorer people can be locked into expensive higher emitting patterns as well. So one illustration of that just now is very pertinent is retrofitting homes. If you're wealthy, you can afford a more expensive home that will be, have a higher EPC rating. Working class communities tend to be locked into or tend to experience much higher levels of fuel poverty, and often live in homes that are quite damp and poorly retrofitted, might not have insulation, double glazing, all of these things that are essential to maintain our health, also cut our fuel bills and cut our emissions at once as well. So important to kind of take those nuances into consideration, as well as understanding the overall disparities in emissions and consumption patterns too. And just lastly, on sequencing, I think it's really important when we're talking about kind of changing the way that we live and the way that we consume and the way that the levels of our carbon emissions as well. One example of this is reform to like fuel duty tax, for example, which is needed, but we need to ensure that people who are poorer also have access to really strong, accessible, affordable or free public transport systems, to ensure that there is actually a mode of transport that people can use as well. So there's also questions of kind of sequencing and how we embed sequencing in a way that yes, greens the economy, but does so in a way that tackles inequalities.
Thank you very much. We've had quite a few more questions coming in, and I don't think we're going to be able to get through all of them, but I will try and do as many as we can. The next one was about from Thalia Kidder saying, oh, my screen keeps jumping around. Great, quite specific proposals of what to do. What about how? What are the factors or conditions, for example, in local councils that facilitate progress? And then from an anonymous attendee, how can we ensure the public remain engaged on taking action on climate change when many are concerned about the current cost of living crisis and being able to survive the day-to-day reality of scarcity? And another anonymous question, how can grassroots groups make an impact globally? What do panelists suggest about the action areas that would stop the exploitation of nature and labour of people in poverty and of women on a global scale? So that is a question on what are the factors that facilitate progress, and there's particular emphasis on local councils. How do we keep the public engaged, and how can grassroots groups make more of an impact globally? Don't feel you need to answer all of those. If you focus on the ones that you think you've got the most to say on, and I'll go to Rebecca again.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I wanted just to start with the public engagement point, because I think that is really key, and that it could, you know, it's one of the steps in terms of, you know, Miriam's talking about sequencing is obviously really crucial to bring people along, and what the government should be doing, but, you know, other parties could also be doing it, is constantly making the association between the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis. That, you know, these are not opposing things with solutions that undercut each other. They have solutions that you know, they share solutions, and they share, you know, they have the same roots as well. And we need to be making that argument much more clearly, and we also need to, you know, we need a kind of a massive public education and awareness program. We saw what could be mobilized during the COVID pandemic. You know, the climate crisis requires, you know, a much more sustained effort to explain to people, you know, what impact our behaviours are having, what impact our system is having on the world, and what's coming down the road, how to prepare. But on the other hand, and this goes kind of to the last question on what grassroots or groups can do, is that we are stuck in this system where, as an individual or as a grassroots organisation, we don't have a huge amount of control over how for change, you know. So we absolutely, you know, we need this movement coming down from the top and up from below, we need the structural change to enable us to make, you know, healthier and greener choices and more solidaristic choices with, you know, communities in the global south. And that's not to say, you know, we should be paralysed at grassroots or at individual level. You know, we can be, you know, making small differences. We can be talking to people about the choices that we're making, and we can be lobbying, you know, our local governments in particular. And I think there is you know, some hope at local government level in particular. I think some councils are doing some really good and really interesting things, and the more that, you know, their constituents lobby them for those actions, the better. So I think it's this kind of, you know, it has to come from all levels, but public engagement is really key, and that's something that has to be happening at national and local and regional level.
Thank you very much. Roshini.
Hi. Yeah, so factors that facilitate progress, like for example at WEN, we've got we started working with local councils on period product schemes and nappies. So really sort of that's information getting across to a lot more people through councils, because they've got a far wide reach in, you know, in their boroughs. And so women and people who menstruate use up to 11,000 period products in their lifetime. So the more women and people that menstruate that we can reach with these messages and then alternatives is actually, you know, quite, it's diverting a lot of waste from landfill, and can say, you know, of up to 90% plastic sort of waste to landfill. And also when initiated the waste minimisation bill to enable councils to work on waste minimisation schemes, and they'd never had this profession before, so small steps but huge impacts. And how can grassroots work globally? I mean, I think through projects like this, where policy think tanks, organisations join with organisations that do grassroots work, and then linking those two things together. I think this Feminist Green New Deal is quite a good example. But also to build solidarity links with other grassroots or groups locally, nationally and globally. And also that grassroots groups have a key role in lobbying local councils. And I think, like, so it's already been said, joined up action, it's like multi-pronged action, each with you know, an element of the change to make.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sam.
Yeah, just on that second question about the interaction with the cost of living crisis, I think what's very interesting about where we are now compared to, say, 2008 and the financial crisis is actually when that recession hit, environmental concern really did drop in the public, and that is not the case now. Like, climate change concern, environmental concern is incredibly robust. And one of the reasons is that the public are way ahead of the current government in seeing the connections between current high prices and environmental issues. So actually, I think it's more of a case of reminding MPs, and there's some interesting polling out recently on the gap between MPs' perceptions and where the public really are on this stuff, about the connections between the cost of living crisis and environmental action, rather than worrying the public aren't going to stay there, where I think the evidence over the last few years is that they will.
Thank you. And Miriam?
Yeah, maybe just speak to the point on local authorities. I mean, I think there has been a real surge in recent years to take up community wealth building at a local level, and that's something that's really compatible with a lot of the areas that's covered in this report, actually. Obviously, there's still a huge need for more macro level change at a government level, but it is amazing to see an appetite for what is effectively like a mass transfer of physical and financial assets to local economies and communities, and what they can do with that, and centering climate justice at the heart of that has, there's a real opportunity to make local economies work for local people, and to create environmental and climate resilience within them, while increasing participation massively at a local level too. And it's rooted in a fair work agenda. It's rooted in a need to diversify land ownership, use and management, and transforming procurement so that it's geared towards the needs of delivering for local communities and economies. And so there's a kind of this, I think it's a really complementary agenda to just transition. It's one which just transition can be centred at the heart of, and it would be amazing to see that flourish. And I hope that as it takes off and becomes kind of popularised, which we're definitely seeing in Scotland on quite a mass scale just now, that it's not watered its meaning, and it's kind of rooted in economic systems change, and local level economic systems change isn't watered down as that happens as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I know that there were further questions that we didn't get to, and I'm really sorry for that. I'd like to really thank all our panelists for what has been an excellent webinar. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. I also like to thank again our funders, Friends Provident Foundation, which has funded the whole of the Feminist Green New Deal programme, and to say that the link to this webinar will be on our website. We will send it along with the report links and everything else to everyone who booked to attend the webinar, and all of our lists. If any of the speakers have got links to reports they'd like us to share as well, we'd be very happy to do that at the same time. And we will be doing more work on this. This isn't, launching the report isn't the end. Obviously, we're promoting the findings of the report, but we're also working now on plans to think about how we can take forward the next steps, and particularly looking at work at a local level. So if you want to keep in touch with all of that, you can sign up to our newsletter on our website, and you get regular updates on that. And you can also read all of the materials that are produced for the Feminist Green New Deal, all the reports and the final report on our website. Thank you all very, very much, and I hope you have a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.